Sarah Martinez climbed off the city bus, her worn backpack pulling at her tired shoulders as she made her way through the tough streets toward home. The evening felt heavy and tense, with angry voices drifting from the corner where young men usually hung around. She'd gotten good at keeping her eyes down and moving fast past them. Tonight, though, something felt off. Sarah was 28 and looked like anyone else coming home exhausted from work. Her black hair sat in a basic ponytail, and she wore her uniform from the local restaurant, where she pulled double shifts to afford night classes. Nobody around here knew Sarah's real story. For 8 years, she'd served as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women who'd survived that punishing training. After 3 combat deployments, she'd chosen civilian life and started studying social work. She wanted to make a difference for people, especially young people growing up in places exactly like this. Adjusting to regular life hadn't come easy, though. Sometimes she longed for the clear rules of service, where everybody understood their role perfectly. Walking toward her building, Sarah spotted trouble immediately. Mrs. Chen, the older Chinese woman from the ground floor, stood outside looking frightened. Her small shopping bag lay torn open on the pavement, oranges scattered everywhere. 3 young guys surrounded her, laughing and blocking her way inside. Sarah recognized them instantly. They went by the Block Kings and wasted their days loitering, harassing neighbors, and stirring up problems. Their leader, Marcus, was tall and lanky, always flashing expensive shoes and gold jewelry. His 2 buddies, Tony and Kevin, trailed him like faithful dogs, ready to do whatever he commanded. Miss Chen kept bending down for her groceries, but each time she reached for something, one of the men kicked it further away. She repeated, "Please," in heavily accented English, which only made them laugh harder. Sarah watched the terror in that old woman's face, and rage burned through her chest. "Come dance for us, Grandma," Marcus taunted, shoving Mrs. Chen's shoulder hard. The elderly woman stumbled back, nearly hitting the ground. Sarah's combat instincts took over instantly. She sized up everything in seconds. 3 opponents, no weapons visible, but young and likely stronger than they appeared. The area was fairly empty, with only a few passers-by deliberately ignoring what was happening. She moved closer, her whole body shifting into something different without conscious thought. Years of training had wired her to project absolute authority when facing danger. "Hey," Sarah called out, her tone even but commanding. "Step away from her." The 3 turned toward her. Marcus flashed a gold-toothed grin. Well, another old biddy playing hero. Sarah positioned herself between Mrs. Chen and the group. "I told you to leave her alone. Take your crew and find somewhere else to be." Tony, a stocky guy covered in tattoos, snorted with laughter. "You gonna stop us? You and what backup?" Sarah nearly laughed at how perfectly ironic that question was. "I don't need backup. I just need you to use whatever brain cells you've got left and disappear." The confrontation was attracting eyes now. Several people had paused at a safe distance, but nobody seemed willing to actually intervene. Sarah got it. Their fear made sense. In neighborhoods like this, involving yourself in someone else's business could cost you dearly. Marcus stepped into Sarah's space, using his height advantage to try intimidating her. "Listen, lady, you don't understand who you're dealing with. We own this block. If we want entertainment from the old Chinese woman, that's nobody's concern but ours." Sarah looked straight up at him without flinching even slightly. "And you have no idea who you're dealing with either. This is your final warning. Leave now." Kevin, the youngest, shifted nervously. "Maybe we should just bail, man. This chick's acting unhinged." But Marcus was having too much fun to quit now. He had spectators watching, and backing down from some woman would destroy his street credibility. "Nah, she needs education about respect." Without warning, Marcus swung his hand and slapped Sarah hard across the face. The crack echoed between the buildings around them. Mrs. Chen gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Sarah's head turned slightly from the force, but her feet never moved. She didn't cry out or show pain. Instead, she slowly rotated her face back toward Marcus, her expression utterly blank. That blank look was more frightening than any scream or curse could have been. "That was your mistake," Sarah said softly, her voice dropping so low only Marcus caught it. For the first time tonight, Marcus felt an uncomfortable flutter in his gut. Something about this woman's reaction seemed wrong. Regular people either swung back immediately or bolted in fear. They didn't just stand there staring at you like they were running calculations. Tony and Kevin closed in, sensing their leader might actually need help. The crowd of watchers grew slightly bigger, everybody feeling that something major was about to go down. Sarah glanced around fast, noting where all 3 men stood, where potential witnesses were positioned, and what escape routes existed. Her mind automatically began planning her response. 8 years of training had taught her that, when somebody takes things physical, you need to finish it fast and completely. Mrs. Chen had backed away toward the building entrance, gripping her purse tight. Sarah felt relief seeing the elderly woman getting clear of what was coming. Marcus rubbed his knuckles and smirked at his friends. See? Some people only learn through pain. He had absolutely no clue he just committed the worst error of his entire life. He had no understanding that the quiet woman in the diner uniform had been trained by the world's best military to handle threats far more serious than three street punks. He had no idea that his simple act of violence was about to teach him and his crew a lesson they'd carry for. The evening air seemed to thicken as Sarah prepared to demonstrate exactly what happens when you challenge someone who's devoted their life to protecting the innocent. Right after Marcus struck her, Sarah felt that familiar rush of controlled intensity that had kept her breathing through countless dangerous operations. Her body shifted into fighting mode automatically, every muscle primed to respond with precision and overwhelming force. Marcus still wore that grin, completely blind to what he'd just triggered. He turned toward his friends, expecting approval for how he'd handled things. That's how you deal with people who forget their play. Tony and Kevin laughed uneasily, but something about Sarah's absolute stillness was unsettling them. She hadn't reacted like people normally did when Marcus hit them. Most folks either crumpled in terror or came back swinging wildly. This woman just stood there watching them with the focused intensity of a hunter studying prey. You made your choice, Sarah said, barely above a whisper. Now you face what comes next. Before Marcus could process her meaning, Sarah, 8 years of elite training had turned her body into a precision instrument, and she deployed every bit of that expertise now. Her opening strike was a lightning-quick punch to Marcus's solar plexus, delivered with surgical accuracy. The hit expelled all air from his lungs and sent him reeling backward, wheezing and clutching his chest. He tried speaking, but nothing emerged except a choked gasp. Tony reacted first, rushing towards Sarah with his fists up. He outweighed her by 60 pounds and probably figured size gave him the advantage. But size meant nothing against someone trained to neutralize opponents twice her mass. Sarah sidestepped Tony's sloppy charge with flowing grace, caught his outstretched arm, and used his own forward motion against him. She twisted his arm behind his back and swept his legs out, sending him face first into the concrete. The impact was severe enough to split his lip and scrape skin off his cheek. Kevin stood paralyzed in shock, watching both his friends get dismantled by someone who moved like she was performing choreography rather than fight. Everything happened so quickly his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. Marcus had finally recovered his breath and was reaching for his phone, probably planning to call reinforcements or capture video evidence. Sarah noticed the movement and smoothly stepped forward, plucking the device from his grip before he could react. "You won't need that," she said, dropping it and crushing it beneath her shoe. The gathered crowd was expanding now. News was traveling through the neighborhood that something incredible was unfolding. People pulled out their own phones to film, but maintained their distance. Even the bystanders could sense the danger radiating from this ordinary-looking woman. Tony was struggling back to his feet, blood pouring from his nose and mouth. Sarah let him stand, watching him carefully as he wiped blood away with his hand. "This can't be real," Tony mumbled through his damaged lip. "You're just some server." "Wrong," Sarah responded calmly. "I'm a Navy SEAL, and you just discovered why we're considered the world's most elite fighters." Marcus's eyes went huge with fear and disbelief. Navy SEALs were practically myths to people in his world. They were the soldiers from movies, the ones who could take down entire buildings full of enemies single-handedly. They weren't supposed to be real humans who served food and rode public transportation. Kevin finally found words. Navy SEAL. Like actual Navy SEAL. Sarah nodded. 8 years active service, 3 combat tours. I've handled terrorists, warlords and enemy fighters who were significantly more dangerous than 3 kids pretending to be tough. The reality was sinking in now, and all 3 young men were beginning to grasp just how catastrophically they'd misjudged this situation. Marcus's hand moved unconsciously to his throat, where he could still feel the aftershock of Sarah's perfectly executed strike. Mrs. Chen had been observing from the building entrance's safety, and now she stepped forward. "Thank you," she said to Sarah, her voice trembling with emotion. "They hassle me every week, sometimes take my shopping money. Nobody ever helped before." Sarah's expression softened when she looked at the elderly woman. "Are you injured, Mrs. Chen?" "No, no injury, just frightened. But not anymore." Sarah turned back to the 3 young men, her manner becoming serious and commanding. "Here's what happens next. You apologize to Miss Chen for harassing her. Then you promise never to bother her or anybody else in this neighborhood again." Marcus was still struggling to process what had just happened. His reputation as the block's toughest guy had been obliterated in under 2 minutes by a woman who barely reached his shoulder. "You can't just walk in here and change everything. This is our territory." Sarah stepped closer and Marcus instinctively retreated. "Your territory? You think intimidating old women and stealing grocery money makes you tough? You think scaring people who can't defend themselves makes you some kind of ruler?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd led soldiers into battle, someone who'd made life or death choices under extreme pressure. I've witnessed real warriors, Mark. I've fought beside people who'd run into burning structures to rescue strangers. I've watched soldiers sacrifice their lives protecting people they'd never met. And you think you're tough because you can push around a 70-year-old woman. Tony wiped more blood from his face. His earlier swagger completely vanished. Look, lady, we didn't realize. You didn't realize what? That actions have consequences. That eventually you might pick on someone who won't tolerate it. Sarah's eyes blazed. Years of suppressed frustration at bullies and cowards surfacing. You didn't realize that your behavior was genuinely hurting innocent people. Kevin was backing up slowly, clearly desperate to be anywhere else. Can we just leave? We're sorry, okay? We won't hassle the old lady anymore. Not yet, Sarah said firmly. First, you apologize to Mrs. Chen properly. Look directly at her and tell her you're sorry for frightening her and stealing her money. The crowd watched in fascination as three neighborhood bullies got lectured like schoolchildren by a woman half their size. Some people were smiling, clearly enjoying watching the tables turn on guys who'd been making everyone's lives miserable. Marcus realized he had no other option. His reputation might be destroyed, but if he tried fighting this woman again, he might end up hospitalized. Or worse, he turned toward Mrs. Chen, his voice barely audible. We're sorry for bothering you. Sarah shook her head. Louder, and mean it. Marcus raised his voice, genuine fear creeping into his tone. We're sorry, Mrs. Chen. We won't bother you anymore. Tony and Kevin mumbled their own apologies, both looking like they wished the earth would open up and swallow them, but Sarah wasn't finished with them yet. The real lesson was just beginning. Sarah studied the three young men standing before her, their earlier arrogance completely deflated, but she understood that a simple apology wouldn't create lasting change. These guys had been terrorizing people in this neighborhood for months, possibly years. They needed to grasp the full weight of their actions and the impact they'd had on the community. The apology is a start, Sarah said, her voice carrying the tone of a drill instructor, addressing new recruits. But words are cheap. Anyone can say sorry when they're cornered. The real question is whether you actually understand what you've been doing to people. Marcus was still rubbing his chest where Sarah had struck him, trying to comprehend how such a small woman had generated so much force. Look, we understand, okay? We messed up. Sarah shook her head. No, you don't understand. Not yet. Tell me, Marcus, do you have a grandmother? The question caught him off guard. Yeah, why? How old is she? Marcus looked confused but answered. Like 70-something. Maybe 75. Sarah gestured toward Mrs. Chen. So about Mrs. Chen's age, tell me, how would you feel if a group of guys cornered your grandmother on the street, knocked her groceries out of her hands, and demanded money from her? For the first time, Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable. The comparison was forcing him to see Miss Chen, not as a target, but as a real person with feelings and fears just like his own family members. That's different, he mumbled, though his voice lacked conviction. How is it different? Sarah pressed. Because she's Chinese? Because her English isn't perfect? Because she's not related to you? Her voice hardened now, the way it had when she needed to get through to soldiers who weren't taking their training seriously. Tony was still dabbing at his bloody lip, but he was listening carefully. Something about Sarah's words was cutting through years of street attitude and making him consider things he'd never thought about before. Sarah continued her lesson. Mrs. Chen arrived in this country 30 years ago with nothing. She worked in factories, cleaned office buildings at night, saved every penny so her children could attend college. Her son's a doctor now. Her daughter teaches school. She built a life here through hard work and sacrifice. She gestured around the neighborhood. And now in her 70s, when she should be able to walk to the store safely, she has to deal with three grown men who think it's entertaining to terrorize her for pocket change. Kevin was shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. We didn't really think about it like that. That's the problem, Sarah said. You didn't think at all. You saw an easy target and decided to exploit her because you could. That's not strength. That's cowardice. The crowd around them had grown even larger. People who'd been hiding in their apartments had come outside, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented sight of someone standing up to the Block Kings. Some of the older residents were smiling, clearly enjoying seeing the tables turned on their tormentors. Miss Chen stepped forward again, her voice stronger now. They take $20 from me last week. Say they protect me, but only from themselves. Sarah turned back to Marcus with fire in her eyes. $20? Do you have any idea what $20 means to someone living on a fixed income? That might be her food money for 3 days. Marcus was beginning to look sick. When he and his friends took money from people, they never thought about what those people had to sacrifice. because of their theft. They just saw it as easy cash for cigarettes, alcohol, or whatever else they wanted. Look, Tony said, blood still trickling from his nose. We'll pay her back. We can get the money. Sarah nodded. That's a good start. But it's not just about the money. It's about what you've taken from her that you can never give back. What do you mean? Kevin asked. Her sense of safety, her ability to walk through her own neighborhood without fear, the peace of mind that comes from knowing you can go about your daily life without being harassed. Sarah's voice was passionate now, drawing from her own experiences of trying to create safe spaces for vulnerable people during her military service. Every time Mrs. Chen walks past this corner, she remembers being pushed around by 3 men who were young enough to be her grandson. Every time she goes to the store, she wonders if today's the day you'll decide to take more than just her money. Marcus was staring at the ground now, genuinely ashamed for the first time in years. His mother had raised him better than this. He remembered being a little kid, holding her hand as they walked through neighborhoods where they were the ones who felt unsafe and unwelcome. Sarah wasn't finished. And it's not just Mrs. Chen. How many other people in this neighborhood cross the street to avoid you? How many elderly people stay inside after dark because they're afraid of running into you? How many kids take longer routes to school because they don't want to walk past your corner? The questions hit home because all 3 young men knew the answer. They'd seen people change their walking patterns to avoid them. They'd noticed the way conversations stopped when they approached. They'd just never cared before. But here's what you really don't understand, Sarah continued. This neighborhood could be something special. These people care about each other. They want to build something good here. But they can't do it when they're afraid to walk outside their own homes. She gestured toward the crowd that had gathered. Look around you. These people came outside tonight because they wanted to see someone finally stand up to you. They want to feel safe in their own community. They want to help each other instead of hiding from bullies. An older man in the crowd called out, "She's right. We've been scared of you boys for too long." A woman with a baby stroller nodded vigorously. "My kids can't even play in the park because you're always there causing trouble." More voices joined in, people who'd been silenced by fear, finally finding the courage to speak up. Years of pent-up frustration and anger were pouring out, and Marcus, Tony, and Kevin were seeing for the first time how their behavior had affected an entire community. Sarah raised her hand, and the crowd quieted down. The respect and authority in her gesture was unmistakable. These people recognized leadership when they saw it. "The question now," Sarah said, turning back to the 3 young men, "is what you're going to do about it. You can keep being part of the problem, or you can decide to be part of the solution." Marcus looked up at her, confusion evident on his face. "What do you mean, part of the solution?" Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, and it transformed her entire face. "That's what we're going to figure out together." Over the next few weeks, something remarkable began to happen in the neighborhood. Sarah had done more than just defeat 3 bullies in a physical confrontation. She had planted seeds of change that were beginning to sprout in unexpected ways. True to their word, Marcus, Tony, and Kevin had pooled their money and paid Mrs. Chen back the $20 they'd stolen from her. But Sarah hadn't let them stop there. She had given them what she called community service assignments that went far beyond simple payback. Real warriors don't just fight, Sarah had told them the day after their confrontation. They protect people who can't protect themselves. They build things instead of tearing them down. They make their communities stronger. Marcus had been skeptical at first. "So what are you saying? We should join the army or something?" Sarah had laughed. "Not necessarily, but you should start acting like men instead of boys. You should start using your strength to help people instead of hurt them." The first assignment she gave them seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. "Mrs. Chen walks to the grocery store every Tuesday and Friday. You're going to make sure she gets there and back safely." Tony had protested. "Come on, that's like being bodyguards for an old lady." "Exactly," Sarah had replied. "You're going to learn what it feels like to be responsible for someone else's safety, instead of being the thing they need safety from." The first Tuesday had been awkward for everyone involved. Miss Chen was clearly nervous about being escorted by the same young men who'd been terrorizing her for months. Marcus, Tony, and Kevin walked stiffly alongside her, unsure of how to behave. But something interesting happened on that first trip. Miss Chen's grocery bag broke just outside the store, spilling cans and vegetables all over the sidewalk. Without thinking, all 3 young men immediately knelt down to help her pick everything up. "Thank you," Miss Chen had said quietly, and for the first time, she looked at them like they were human beings instead of threats. By the second week, the escorts had become almost natural. Mrs. Chen started telling them about her grandchildren and asking about their family. Marcus discovered that she made the best dumplings he'd ever tasted. Tony learned that she'd been a seamstress in China and still did alterations to make extra money. Kevin, who'd always been the quietest of the three, found himself genuinely enjoying the conversations. Mrs. Chen reminded him of his own grandmother, who died when he was 12. Sarah had been watching their progress from a distance, noting how the simple act of being responsible for someone else's well-being was changing their behavior. But she wasn't finished with them yet. The grocery store trips are good, she told them during one of their weekly check-ins. But this neighborhood has bigger problems than one elderly woman who needs help carrying groceries. She'd been walking around the area every day, using her military observation skills to assess the community's needs. What she found was both heartbreaking and inspiring. There were elderly people who were essentially prisoners in their own homes, afraid to go outside after dark. There were working parents who couldn't afford childcare and had to leave their kids unsupervised after school. There were teenagers with nothing to do and nowhere to go, making them easy targets for gangs and drug dealers. But there were also people trying to make a difference. Ms. Rodriguez, who owned the corner bodega, stayed open late specifically so people would have a safe place to wait for buses. Mrs. Washington, a retired teacher, was trying to start an after-school program, but didn't have enough volunteers. The community center had space for activities, but lacked funding and manpower. Sarah started connecting these pieces, like a military strategist planning a mission. She saw how the neighborhood could be transformed if people just had the right leadership and organization. Here's your next assignment, she told Marcus, Tony and Kevin. There are kids in this neighborhood who walk home from school every day through some dangerous areas. You're going to make sure they get home safely. Marcus looked confused. Like all of them, start with the younger one. The kids between 8 and 12, who live more than 6 blocks from the school. Tony was catching on to Sarah's thinking. So we become like crossing guards. You become protectors, Sarah corrected. You learn what it feels like to have people depend on you for something important. The first day of their new assignment was a disaster. A group of third graders took one look at Marcus, Tony and Kevin, and ran in the opposite direction. Word had spread through the school that the Block Kings were trying to grab kids after school. It took 3 days and lots of explanation from parents before the children started to trust their new escorts. But once they did, something magical began to happen. 8-year-old Maria started telling Tony about her drawing. 10-year-old James asked Marcus to help him with his math homework during the walk home. Kevin found himself breaking up fights between siblings and mediating playground disputes. I never realized how scary this neighborhood looks when you're little, Kevin told Sarah one evening. Some of these kids are terrified of walking past certain corners. Sarah nodded. Fear changes everything about how you see the world. These kids deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhood. As the weeks passed, other people in the community began to notice the change. The 3 young men who'd once been sources of fear were now being greeted with smiles and waves. Children ran up to them excitedly after school. Parents stopped them on the street to say thank you. But the most dramatic change was in Marcus, Tony and Kevin themselves. They stood differently now, with the posture of people who had responsibility and purpose. They spoke more carefully, aware that little ears were always listening. They started dressing better, knowing that they were representing something larger than themselves. One evening, as Sarah watched them walking a group of children home from school, she realized that her military training had prepared her for this moment in ways she'd never expected. Creating positive change in a community required the same strategic thinking, leadership skills, and dedication that had made her successful as a Navy SEAL. But she also knew that the real test was still coming. Word was spreading through the wider area that the Block Kings had gone soft. Other gangs were starting to take notice of what they saw as weakness, and some people in positions of power weren't happy about the changes happening in the neighborhood. Sarah could sense the approaching storm, and she knew that everything they'd built was about to be challenged in ways that would test not just her fighting skills, but her ability to inspire others to fight for what was right. The trouble started on a Thursday evening in late October. Sarah was walking home from her night classes at the community college when she noticed something was wrong. The usual groups of children playing outside were nowhere to be seen. The elderly residents who normally sat on their front steps in the evening were inside with their curtains drawn. Marcus, Tony, and Kevin were standing on their usual corner, but their body language was different. Instead of the relaxed confidence they'd developed over the past month, they looked tense and alert, constantly scanning the street like soldiers on patrol. Sarah approached them carefully, her own military instincts picking up on the danger in the air. "What's going on?" Marcus looked relieved to see her. Over the weeks, he'd come to think of Sarah as something like a commanding officer, someone whose guidance he could trust in difficult situations. "The serpents showed up this afternoon," he said quietly. "They're claiming this territory now." Sarah knew about the serpents. They were a much larger and more violent gang that controlled several neighborhoods across the city. Unlike Marcus and his friends, who'd mostly been guilty of petty theft and intimidation, the serpents dealt drugs, carried weapons, and had connections to organized crime. "What exactly did they say?" Sarah asked. Tony gestured toward the community center, where several expensive cars were parked. "Their leader, a guy called Snake, he comes rolling up with like 10 guys, says he's heard the Block Kings went soft, and now this territory belongs to him." Kevin, who'd always been the most observant of the three, added details that made Sarah's blood run cold. "They weren't just marking territory. They were asking questions about the kids we walk home from school, about which families have money, about who might be willing to deal drugs." Sarah felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had driven her through her military service. These weren't just criminals looking to expand their territory. They were predators, looking to exploit the most vulnerable people in the community. "Where are they now?" she asked. "Snake and 2 of his guys are inside the community center talking to Mr. Patterson," Marcus replied. "The rest of them are spread out around the neighborhood, checking things out." Sarah knew Mr. Patterson. He was the community center director, a good man who was trying to provide safe activities for local kids. He was also someone who could be easily intimidated by the kind of pressure the serpents specialized in applying. "What did you 3 tell them?" Marcus straightened his shoulders. "We told them this neighborhood was under protection, that they needed to leave." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Sarah felt a surge of pride. A month ago, these same young men would have probably tried to join forces with the serpents. Now they were standing up to a much more dangerous gang, to protect their community. "And what did they say to that?" Tony's expression was grim. Snake laughed. "Said we had until midnight to clear out, or they'd make us an example for anyone else who wanted to challenge them." Sarah looked at her watch. It was already past 9. In less than 3 hours, this situation was going to escalate into violence unless she could find a way to resolve it. Her military training kicked into high gear. She began mentally cataloging available resources, potential allies, and possible strategies. The serpents had superior numbers and firepower, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory. The community might be afraid, but they'd been building trust and loyalty over the past month. "Listen to me very carefully," Sarah told the 3 young men. "I need you to go door to door and talk to people. Tell them what's happening. Tell them that if the serpents take over this neighborhood, everything we've built together is going to disappear." Marcus looked confused. "What good is that going to do? These people aren't fighters." Sarah smiled, the same expression she'd worn when explaining battle strategy to new recruits. "You'd be surprised what ordinary people are capable of when they're protecting something they care about. The question is whether they believe they have something worth protecting." She assigned each of them specific blocks to cover, with clear instructions on what to say and how to organize people. "Don't ask them to fight. Ask them to be witnesses. Ask them to make noise. Ask them to show the serpents that this community is united." As the 3 young men headed off on their missions, Sarah walked toward the community center. She needed to assess the situation with Snake directly, and she needed to buy time for the neighborhood to organize. The community center lobby was eerily quiet. Sarah could hear voices coming from Mr. Patterson's office, and she moved closer to listen. "You seem like a reasonable man," Snake was saying in a voice that managed to be both friendly and threatening. "All we're asking for is cooperation. We provide protection. You provide information about who's got money, who's got kids that might be interested in making some extra cash." Mr. Patterson's voice was shaky but defiant. "I'm not going to help you hurt these families." There was a sound like a chair being knocked over, followed by a grunt of pain. "Maybe you didn't understand me correctly," Snake said, his tone much colder now. Sarah had heard enough. She pushed open the office door and stepped inside, immediately taking in the scene. Mr. Patterson was on the floor, blood trickling from his nose. 2 large men flanked Snake, who was sitting casually behind the desk like he already owned the place. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Snake looked her up and down dismissively. "Lady, you need to leave. This is business." Sarah closed the door behind her and smiled. "Actually, I think this is exactly where I need to be. You see, you're in my neighborhood threatening my people. That makes it my business." One of Snake's men started to move toward her, but Snake held up a hand to stop him. Something about Sarah's calm confidence was making him curious. "Your neighborhood?" Snake laughed. Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but in about 2 hours, this is going to be my neighborhood, and anyone who doesn't like that is going to have serious problems. Sarah helped Mr. Patterson to his feet, checking to make sure his injuries weren't serious. Then she turned back to Snake with the same expression she'd worn when facing down Marcus and his friends weeks earlier. Actually, she said quietly, I think you're the one who's about to have serious problems. You see, you just made the same mistake those other guys made. You assumed that because I look like an ordinary woman, I must be helpless. Snake was beginning to sense that something wasn't right about this situation. Are you threatening me? Sarah shook her head. I'm educating you. This community is under the protection of someone who's been trained to deal with people exactly like you. Someone who's spent years learning how to neutralize threats to innocent people. Outside, she could hear the sound of doors opening and people talking in the street. Marcus, Tony, and Kevin were doing their job, and the neighborhood was beginning to respond. Snake's expression was darkening with anger and confusion. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but it's about to end very badly for you. Sarah looked at him with the same calm intensity that had terrified Marcus weeks earlier. The only game here is the one where you leave this neighborhood right now and never come back. Because if you don't, you're going to learn exactly what happens when you threaten a community that's under the protection of a Navy SEAL. The revelation that Sarah was a Navy SEAL hit Snake like a physical blow. His two bodyguards immediately tensed up, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons concealed under their jackets. But Snake held up a hand to stop them, his street-smart instincts telling him that this situation had just become much more complicated than a simple territorial takeover. Navy SEAL, he repeated slowly, studying Sarah's face for any sign that she was bluffing. You're serious? 8 years active duty, Sarah confirmed, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded respect in life-or-death situations. 3 tours overseas, specialized in neutralizing high-value targets and protecting civilian populations. Outside, the sound of voices was growing louder. Through the community center windows, Snake could see people emerging from their homes, many of them carrying flashlights or cell phones. What had been an empty, intimidated neighborhood just an hour ago was transforming into something that looked disturbingly like an organized resistance. Snake tried to maintain his composure, but Sarah could see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. He was used to dealing with street gangs, petty criminals, and frightened civilians. Navy SEALs were completely outside his area of expertise. Even if that's true, Snake said, you're one person, I've got 15 guys in this neighborhood right now, and more I can call if I need them. Sarah nodded calmly. That's a lot of people, but here's what you haven't considered. Those 15 guys are spread out over several blocks in territory they don't know, facing a community that's no longer afraid of them. As if to illustrate her point, the sound of car alarms suddenly filled the air. Then another alarm. And another. Within minutes, it sounded like every car in the neighborhood was honking and beeping simultaneously. Snake jumped up from the desk, moving to the window to see what was happening. What he saw made his blood run cold. Groups of residents were surrounding his men's vehicles, not attacking them but making it impossible for them to leave quietly. Cell phone cameras were recording everything, creating evidence of the serpent's presence that could be turned over to police. What is this? Snake demanded. Sarah smiled. This is what happens when you threaten a community that's learned to work together. Every person out there has a camera. Every face is being recorded. She gestured toward the window where Snake could see Marcus, Tony, and Kevin moving through the crowd, coordinating the civilian response with military-like precision. Those 3 young men used to be the neighborhood bullies. Now they're community protectors, and they've learned from someone who knows how to organize an effective defense. One of Snake's bodyguards pulled out his phone, trying to call for backup, but the call wouldn't go through. Boss, the cell towers are jammed or something. I can't get a signal. Sarah's smile widened. Actually, they're not jammed. They're just overwhelmed. When 200 people in the same area all start making phone calls at the same time, the local cell tower gets overloaded. It's a technique we used overseas when we needed to disrupt enemy communications. Snake was beginning to realize that he'd walked into something much more sophisticated than a simple neighborhood dispute. This wasn't random community resistance. This was a coordinated operation planned and executed by someone with military training. You planned this, he said accusingly. I prepared for it, Sarah corrected. The moment Marcus told me you were asking questions about local children, I knew we were dealing with predators, not just criminals. And predators who target children get the full military response. Mr. Patterson, who'd been quietly listening from the corner where he was holding ice to his bloody nose, suddenly spoke up. There are people from 6 different neighborhoods out there. Word spread through the community groups online. This isn't just about our block anymore. Snake looked out the window again and realized that the crowd had grown much larger than he'd initially noticed. There were people he didn't recognize, people who clearly didn't live in this immediate area, but who'd come to show support. Social media, Sarah explained, seeing his confusion. When communities start communicating with each other, sharing information about threats, it becomes much harder for predators to operate. Your reputation preceded you, Snake. Lots of people in this city have been waiting for a chance to push back against the serpents. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone in the room freeze. Snake's remaining bodyguard looked toward the door, clearly calculating escape routes.
Police? Snake asked. Sarah shook her head. Better. Fire department. Someone called in reports of gas leaks near all your vehicles. They'll have to be inspected before they can be moved. That's going to take hours. Snake was beginning to understand the full scope of what he was facing. His men were trapped in a neighborhood full of witnesses, his vehicles were immobilized, and his communication was disrupted. But more than that, he was facing someone who'd turned an entire community into a coordinated defensive unit. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you to leave, Sarah said simply. I want you to take your men and your business somewhere else, and I want you to spread the word that this neighborhood and the people in it are permanently off limits to the serpents. And if I refuse, Sarah's expression became deadly serious, then you'll discover why Navy SEALs have a 100% mission success rate, because I've been trained to complete objectives regardless of the odds against me, and my objective right now is to protect these people. She stepped closer to Snake, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. I've eliminated terrorist cells, neutralized enemy commanders, and dismantled criminal organizations that were much better armed and better organized than yours. The only difference is that those operations happened overseas where I had to follow rules of engagement designed to minimize civilian casualties. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Snake was a street criminal, but he wasn't stupid. He understood exactly what Sarah was telling him. One of his men spoke up nervously. Boss, we need to get out of here. This is getting too complicated. Snake looked out the window one more time at the crowd of people who'd transformed from frightened victims into an organized resistance in less than an hour. He thought about the months of planning it had taken to identify this neighborhood as a potential territory. He thought about the lost revenue and damaged reputation. But mostly he thought about the calm certainty in Sarah's voice when she described her military training. He'd dealt with tough guys and street fighters his entire life. He'd never dealt with someone who'd been professionally trained to eliminate threats. Fine, he said finally, we'll leave, but this isn't over. Sarah nodded. Yes it is, because now every community group in the city knows your vehicles, your faces, and your methods. Because there are 200 witnesses who can testify about what happened here tonight, and because you now know that there are people in these neighborhoods who refuse to be victims. As Snake and his men prepared to leave, Sarah realized that something much more significant had happened than just winning a single confrontation. An entire community had discovered that they didn't have to live in fear. And she discovered that her military training had prepared her not just for war but for building peace. 6 months later, the neighborhood was almost unrecognizable from the place where Sarah had first confronted Marcus, Tony, and Kevin. What had begun as a simple act of defending an elderly woman had grown into something that surprised even Sarah with its scope and impact. The community center that had once been a target for gang takeover was now the heart of a thriving neighborhood organization. Mr. Patterson had recovered from his injuries and worked with Sarah to establish programs that addressed the root causes of crime and violence. There were after-school tutoring programs, job training workshops, and community gardens that turned vacant lots into gathering places. Marcus had enrolled in classes to get his GED and was working part-time at the community center, helping to coordinate the neighborhood watch program that had grown out of their initial resistance to the serpents. The young man who'd once intimidated people for money was now someone parents trusted with their children's safety. Tony had discovered a talent for working with his hands and was learning carpentry through a trade program that Sarah had helped establish. He spent his weekends helping elderly residents repair their homes and had become something of a neighborhood handyman. The split lip that had been his badge of shame from their first confrontation had healed, but he still touched it sometimes. Remembering the moment his life had changed direction, Kevin, the quietest of the three, had surprised everyone by showing a gift for working with younger children. He'd become the unofficial leader of the after-school program, helping kids with homework and organizing activities that kept them engaged and off the streets. The boy who'd once followed others into trouble was now someone others looked to for guidance. But the changes went far beyond just the three young men who'd started it all. Mrs. Chen had become something of a neighborhood celebrity, her story inspiring other elderly residents to become more active in community affairs. She now taught cooking classes at the community center, sharing traditional Chinese recipes while improving her English through conversation with her students. The success of their neighborhood had attracted attention from city officials, social workers, and even military personnel who were interested in how Sarah had applied her combat training to civilian community building. She'd been invited to speak at conferences about urban renewal and veteran reintegration. However, Sarah's greatest pride came from the smaller, everyday victories that most people never noticed. Children walked to school without fear. Elderly residents sat on their front porches in the evenings. Small businesses were opening where before there'd been only vacant storefronts. The ripple effects had spread to surrounding neighborhoods as well. Communities that had heard about their success were reaching out for advice on organizing their own resistance to crime and violence. Sarah found herself traveling throughout the city, teaching other groups how to apply the same principles that had transformed her corner of the world. One evening, as Sarah walked home from her college classes, she stopped at the corner where everything had begun. A small memorial garden had been planted there, not to commemorate any tragedy but to celebrate the transformation of the community. A simple plaque read, "In honor of neighbors who chose courage over fear." Marcus, Tony, and Kevin were there, as they often were in the evenings, talking with residents and keeping an eye on things. But their presence was no longer about intimidation or control. They'd become genuine community leaders, people who others approached for help and advice. "Hey Sarah," Marcus called out when he saw her. "How were classes tonight?" Sarah was finishing her master's degree in social work, funded partly by scholarships she'd received for her community organizing work. "Good. We studied conflict resolution techniques. I learned some new things I can teach you guys." Tony laughed. "As if you haven't taught us enough already." But Sarah knew that she'd learned as much from them as they had from her. Her military training had given her the tools to organize and lead, but these three young men had taught her something equally valuable about forgiveness, second chances, and the possibility of transformation. A group of children ran past, chasing a ball that had bounced into the street. Kevin automatically moved to block traffic, making sure they could retrieve it safely. The kids thanked him and continued their game, completely comfortable with his presence. "You know what's funny?" Kevin said, watching the children play. "6 months ago those same kids would have run the other way if they saw us coming." Sarah nodded. "That's what happens when people choose to be protectors instead of predators. The whole world looks different." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Chen appeared from her building, carrying a plate of dumplings she'd made for the evening shift of neighborhood watch volunteers. At 75 years old, she'd become one of the most active organizers in the community, fluent in both English and several other languages spoken by recent immigrants. "Sarah," she called out, "you must take some dumplings home. You're too skinny." Sarah accepted the food gratefully, marveling at how this woman, who'd once been terrorized on this very corner, was now one of its most confident residents. A police car drove slowly past, and the officer behind the wheel waved at the group. 6 months ago, police rarely patrolled this neighborhood, unless they were responding to crimes. Now they made regular friendly visits, working with the community watch to prevent problems before they started. "Do you ever miss it?" Tony asked suddenly. "The military, I mean. All the action and excitement." Sarah considered the question seriously. "I miss the sense of purpose. I miss knowing that what I was doing mattered. But I found something here that I never had in the military." "What's that?" Marcus asked. "I get to see the long-term results of my work. In the military, we'd complete a mission and then move on to the next assignment. We rarely got to see how our actions affected people's lives over time." She gestured around the neighborhood. "Here, I get to watch children grow up feeling safe. I get to see elderly people regain their confidence. I get to watch former enemies become friends." As the evening grew darker, more residents came outside to sit on their steps and chat with neighbors. The sounds were different than they'd been 6 months ago. Instead of arguments and threats, there was laughter and conversation in multiple languages. Sarah realized that in trying to help transform a community, she'd been transformed as well. The warrior skills that had been trained for destruction had found new purpose in creation. The leadership abilities that had been developed for combat had become tools for building peace. The Navy SEAL motto is, "The only easy day was yesterday," Sarah told the three young men who'd become her closest allies in this ongoing mission. "But I think we need a new motto for community organizers." "What would that be?" Kevin asked. Sarah looked around at the thriving neighborhood, at the children playing safely in the street, at the elderly residents chatting comfortably on their porches, at the former bullies who'd become protectors. "Every day is a chance to build something better," she said finally. As the group prepared to part ways for the evening, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. It had started with a simple act of courage in defense of a vulnerable person. It had grown into something that none of them could have imagined. But most importantly, it had proven that real strength wasn't about the ability to destroy or intimidate. Real strength was about the courage to protect, the wisdom to lead, and the patience to build something lasting. The neighborhood was safe, but more than that, it was thriving. And Sarah knew that the lessons they'd learned together would continue to spread, one community at a time, proving that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose courage over fear.